Colonel Jim Wood. Now, Jim has had a number of distinguished careers, I would say. He's a graduate of Sydney University and Sydney Teachers College, where he trained as a secondary school teacher, teaching mainly English and history. And he did that for a little while and then got some postgraduate qualifications. But over the period from 67 to 84, he held a range of civilian appointments with the Department of Defence and the Department of Foreign Affairs, and a number of postings. He returned to teaching in 1988 and retired in 2010 as the head of English at Fair Hills High School, and where he was also a long-term coordinator of the Knox Bright Sparks Steering Committee, responsible for promoting gifted education in the Knox district. Since retirement, he's continued to research and write on Australia's military history particularly, and on behalf of those Australians who served in the BCOF. Now, he spent 37 years as a citizen soldier, enlisting in 1956 and holding numerous appointments in various categories. But he became the first Army Reserve officer to be awarded a Defence Fellowship and spent a year on full-time service overseas, visiting the United States, the United Kingdom and Europe, Sweden and West Germany. During that time he produced a major study on Army mobilisation. Now, Dr. Wood established the Herring Lectures at MUR, the Thin Red Line Lectures at Headquarters 3rd Division, and the Infantry Newsletter. He's contributed numerous articles and written a number of books. In other words, the old adage that for academics, publish or perish, is not part of his manifesto, because he certainly didn't perish. Today he's going to speak to us about soldiers from the wars returning from shell shock to PTSD. Now, Jim, if you would like to step forward. Thank you very much for giving us your time, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for turning out on such a miserable day. I walked out of the garage without my warm coat, turned around, got it, and I feel better for it. When we talk about this question of soldiers from the war returning, there are two major issues that become obvious. One is, how are these soldiers that are sent to foreign places under legislation that governments enact and conditions of service that they announce, how are they treated when they come back from that service in terms of those legislative, regulatory and conditions of service? The answer is normally badly. The second aspect of soldiers from the war returning concerns the physical, mental and emotional health of the men and women who served, and how their service influenced their health during their service, and particularly upon their return. How is that looked after? And I see those as the two major issues. Now, when I was looking at these issues in terms of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, I had a phone call last year about February, March, and I was working on my major interest since retirement, which is higher command during the Gallipoli campaign. And I'm well advanced on that subject. I've actually got the Subla. But more to do. But when I got this phone call, I put it aside. I had a phone call from one of the four fellows I've been in touch with since I started my interest in BCOF. It was the major section of my PhD. I talked to a lot of people who'd served in BCOF, and then I decided to write the first Australian history unofficial history of their service. Now, I kept in touch with these people, and as time went on, I found myself immersed in writing up for various public inquiries into whether or not these men and women deserve certain things. And despite the fact that they'd served under the Defence Act that defined active service as military occupation of foreign territory, and that came out of the Army Act of 1883, despite the fact it was called under active service, there was no subsequent entitlement to most of them, or still some of them, to the active service medal or the active service badge. Further, when you get into it, and this is what got me started on shell shock, there's no official history. I remember having a lot to do with this gentleman, a chap called Roger Dunlop, and he's written this beautiful book called The Nowhere Place, and it's his autobiography. And he was an RMO with one of the first battalions, part of the Australian battalions. And he did a lot of good work on venereal disease amongst the troops. And at the end of that, Robertson, the CNC, called him in and said, "I'm recommending you for an MBE for the work you've done." Now, Dunlop's MBE and any number of other honours and awards for Australians have never been honoured. I've got a whole list of them. But British officers who were serving in Beecroft, recommended by the CNC, and New Zealand officers, eventually their recommendations were accepted. Despite the fact that these men and women were put into Kure, with being firebombed by the Americans, and Hiroshima Prefecture, the site of the first atomic bomb, there's been no health or mortality study on any of these people. Now, when I got Roger Dunlop's book, there's a chapter on what they call residual radiation and an annex on the same subject, talking about what happened in terms of what they call residual radiation. When the bomb goes off, there's ionising radiation. The Australians were there at that stage, except for some POWs elsewhere. But residual radiation is what stays behind. And these men and women were committed to cleaning up Hiroshima, finding where the Japanese poison gas dumps were, and all the rest of it. So that got me started as an issue. And I've been doing a case study on justice delayed is justice denied. And I've got about 130,000 words on that. And I'm pleased to see a new government. And I'm going to try it on with a new government. Briefly, what I intend to do is to look at some of the literature about shell shock and PTSD over the century since it became a major issue in 1914. One interesting postscript, if you like, is that when Bridges was raising the first AIF, he suggested to the Minister for Defence, Millen, make a point of putting in place legislation to protect these men being enlisted in the first AIF. It was Bridges that got that started, the whole business of repatriation and the rest of it. Within the same month, August, the first 4 fatalities occurred in the attempt or the action to reoccupy or occupy German New Guinea. Now this is, thank you.
Just in case you need.
Thanks very much. This next section is an extract from a letter to a chap called Les Martin. Les was a machine gunner with the 8th Brigade, and he's writing his letter from a hospital called the War Hospital in England, dated the 31st of July 1916. Dear Jack, I was in a bit of a fight the other day, and as you know, came off second best. I was not in the real fighting for more than 10 hours before I got hit. Though we were under shell fire all that time. My own little company went into battle 100 strong, and later on we barely mustered 20. And yet battalions went in 1,000 and came out as 60, or others 100. All units suffered terribly. In fact, it was just like slaughter, what with shells, machine guns and bombs. It was just like hell let loose in its worst form. The Germans were not only intent on killing, but they had snipers in no man's land, the space between our first lines and theirs, sniping our wounded as they lay helpless, all while trying to crawl back to our own lines. And later on in his letter, when he actually gets into the front line, he's stepping on bodies and getting used to the idea of the slaughter that's affected our own front line before the attack goes in. A shell burst at just a short distance and I saw a portion of a man's arm cut off as clean as a whistle, while some of our chaps were walking along. Just before they got cover and killed 3 outline and wounded 1 or 2. The chap that was carrying the tripod for the gun had it blown out of his hands and he was killed. The chap with the gun had it put out of order and both his legs blown off, and so on. And then he comes to this. 1 or 2 of the chaps got shell shocked and others got really frightened. It was piteous to see them. One great big chap got away as soon as he reached the firing line and could not be found when he was wanted. I saw him in the morning in a dugout. He was white with fear and shaking like a leaf. One of our lieutenants got shell shock and he literally cried like a child. Some that I saw carried down out of the firing line were struggling and calling out for their mother, while others were blabbering sentences one could not make out. For one to get shell shock, it is worse than a wound. A wound will heal, but a chap when he's lost control of his nerves takes a lot before he's got mastery of them again. And it is doubtful if he'll ever be able to be relied on again. It is a thing everyone has to fight against. And if he gives in at all, he is practically done as a fighter. Now there's much more of that, but that's the bit I wanted to emphasise. Now, one of the most impressive reports I came across with regard to shell shock is written by an American Reserve Army officer, a medical officer who was a psychiatrist. His name is Salmon. And his report is online. You just type in salmon and shell shock and up will come his report. It's very, very impressive. Shell shock was given its name by the psychiatrist that was with the British Expeditionary Force that went across the Channel to assist the French. And it was in vogue by the end of December 1914, when 1 in 4 casualties were diagnosed as shell shock. The figure grew to 1916 to two-fifths of the force as casualties due to shell shock. Now, Salmon later reported that if you looked at these matters of medical and mental and emotional health, you could take out 1/7 of all discharges. But if you remove wounds from the calculation, it's 1/3 due to mental and emotional conditions. The interesting thing was its excess amongst officers. Elsewhere in other notes it talks about shell shock is particularly vulnerable, or men with high intelligence and women are particularly vulnerable to shell shock. Just a matter of fact. Now, Salmon worked on the basis of 1 officer to 30 men, 1 to 24 in terms of wounded. But when it got to the really nasty end of this shell shock, which was insanity, the figure went to 1 in 6. So Salmon was very influential, and I'll come back to him. Now, I think this credible photograph just sums up what we're talking about. Now, in 1920, the British government commissioned a War Office Committee of Inquiry into shell shock. And this is on the front cover. This is available at the State Library in and you just walk in and ask for it. This War Office Committee of Inquiry. And what I'm suggesting to you, I'm only going to touch base very quickly. There's plenty of other reading you can do if you want to follow this up. Now the report is something to read. They had a distinguished committee of psychiatrists and legal people and people who'd served at the front, and they knew all about shell shock. Well, you really do wonder, because the first observation, even though their terms of reference were specifically to look at shell shock, to identify it and say what we can do about it. The first thing in their report was to dismiss it as a term, as a grievous misnomer. Do not use this expression, shell shock. Rationale, it is a convenient cop-out. Now just start to think of the mentality that can jump to that conclusion. It's a cop-out and men use it. And that accounts for any number of desertions and situations of cowardice and so on. Now I'm not going to overdo that, but that was the first main conclusion from their report. And when you looked at the way in which their report was conducted, one of the first items in the report was, we haven't got any statistics. And you think, how on earth can you prepare a report on accidents or incidents of disease and no statistics? And what's more, we went to the senior person in charge of the records, and it'd be too hard to find and take too long to get. So, we then moved to observations, what you might call anecdotal material. And this was where it gets really interesting. Well, before that, I'll just mention their diagnosis. There is what they call a commotional disturbance, in other words, a loud sound, like a shell or a bomb, and or emotional disturbance caused by other factors. Now what they found when they got into it, and Salmon talks about this, that what muddied the waters there were men reporting with shell shock who had been nowhere near a shell or a bomb. And that was very, very interesting. So this committee comes up with this delineation. They also identified any number of nervous conditions. But they see this expression as a cop-out rather than something that's a massive challenge. Now, no statistics, but then we've got J.F.C. Fuller, a noted historian of the day, who gives evidence and says, well, when we were in South Africa, 1899, 1901, 2, I remember a Canadian officer, he was okay for about the first month or 6 weeks, and then we had to arrest him because of the operational conditions. So that gets into the folklore. Yes, well, we have memories of men needing to be officers, need to be relieved. The second thing was they start to use language, the words, for example. And they have the Lucknow experience, where a lady who'd married a British regular, his regiment was stationed at Lucknow. She had 2 children with this chap. She was away from Lucknow when the massacre of the regiment occurred during the Indian Mutiny. Now, she came back to Lucknow, later married another British regular, a couple of children, life of the party, until someone said Lucknow. And that set her off. She just fell to bits. And there are other examples of that sort of thing. The other fact that came up was the type of man that was being recruited for the British Army. And this report of 1922 actually said, if we're recruiting today, we recruit from the 30,000 men in the UK who have not been able to get a job. That's our recruiting base. And there's no evidence in any of our previous history that we can really recall of British regular other ranks, right, having this condition. And the reason for that is, if they did, it would be classified as cowardice or insanity, and they would be treated accordingly. So, one of the recommendations is we put this whole business on a modern and scientific basis. You think, where have you been? You just had a world war. And now you're saying, let's look at this scientifically rather than anecdotally. But eliminate shell shock. There are various proposals for treatment for men, including getting them back into the line as quickly as possible. Now, that was a desirable objective. Once they started to settle down and get a clear grasp of this shell shock, they started to do that well. They also emphasised the importance of esprit de corps, the unit, the regiment above all. Now, the work I'm doing on Gallipoli, I've got an extract from Hamilton. And he's watching one of the terrible battles at Hellas. And he's standing on a hill, and he's writing this down later. And he says something like, I wish the world was standing alongside me and watching the regiment moving out of the trenches in neat lines and properly spaced into the face of the enemy fire, machine gun fire. And I've written in my account, my comment on that, if Hamilton and his rest of the world had turned half right, they would have seen the slaughter of the Collingwood battalion. And my memory is that one subaltern survived that Collingwood battalion. So we've got attitudes to deal with as well. Now just pushing on, the recruiting was based entirely on physical fitness. There was no psychological testing. And therefore they were recruiting any number of men with conditions, already existing conditions. Now Salmon, when he started to examine the men who'd been committed to hospitals for the insane, found 18% were mental defectives. Another large group, manic depressives, and epilepsy and dementia. They had those conditions before they entered the army and ended up in an insane hospital. Now, when you look at the whole treatment of the insane business, and we come to the way governments behave, it breaks your heart, because these men are flowing back, the army doesn't know how to cope with them because they haven't got the psychiatrists and properly trained staff, so they just dump them on the civil mental hospitals, rename the name War Hospital, and fill it up with these men who are classified as insane. The hospitals fill up and the capacity to hold it fill up. So what does the government do? Well, the army says, let's tip out as many as we can into the care of their families, which they did. If there was a wife, if there was a mum, you shove that poor fella out and say, look after him. And one of the terrible consequences of that is invariably he will die, because he needs treatment that he's not going to get back with mum. And I'll come back to mum right at the end of my talk. One other point, I was listening to the radio while I was doing some work in the last couple of months, and there was a reference to a 2006 report, press report, that the Defence Secretary in the UK had pardoned 306 people who had been executed for cowardice in the First World War. Right? Now I looked it up. 18 of the 306 have been executed for cowardice. The rest mainly for desertion. Invariably they were other ranks. And there's also suggestion in the press reporting that officers were looked after especially well. Right? Now here we are all these years later saying, commenting on the fact that we didn't get this shell shock bit straight, so there would be any number of men, if they'd been treated properly, may well not have been executed. So we got this group pardon. They got a pardon, but when you look at the fine print, the fact of their sentence has not been erased from the record. Now, we come to a shift, and this is an important shift. One of the things that is difficult to understand, and I made a point about it at the start, a man can come back and he's taking his discharge and someone fills in his record on discharge. And I'll come back to that in general terms in a minute. But what they don't know at that stage, so he might be classified as fit on discharge, invariably so. Or if he's got an obvious physical wound, so and so, but not necessarily mental or emotional. Now what happened, there was an Australian Royal Commission into War Disability in 1924, and the key finding was the question of recognition of belated manifestation of disability. In other words, subsequently, a condition will appear that we didn't know about before, and therefore, invariably, we will ignore it. Now, when I was into teaching, I went back when most teachers were retiring at 54-11. And I've been back about 10 years and I'm attending one funeral after another of teachers, mainly cancers, male and female. I said to my eldest daughter, who's the doctor, darling, I'm surrounded by people who are dying. And she said, Dad, your father's generation lasted a few years after retirement and died. What we're doing is keeping alive longer, and the things you didn't know about are going to get you. Now, when I look back on that, I might have been conscious of dementia in terms of old people. I hadn't heard of Alzheimer's. I didn't know about the push about prostate cancer, and so on. Now, these things are out there after me. All right? Take that idea and use it in terms of men coming back from the wars. Now, they acknowledged, yes, men came down with TB and blindness and all sorts of venereal diseases and so on, and they had to be treated. But it needed this Royal Commission to say, we have a problem and we need to fix it. Now the fascinating bit was that led me on to the Hansard of 1929, where we get parliamentary recognition. It takes 5 years. We get parliamentary recognition of clinical evidence of war service disability along those lines. Got it? Now, how does that come about? Well, first, I'll jump ahead a bit here. The accepted figures for Australians who served overseas with the AIF on active service conditions is just under 332,000. And the accepted death rate, now I don't want an argument about it, but the figure was 60,200. Now the next bit of information that comes out is that in 1929, 11 years after the armistice, 25,000 men who were on pensions from their service had died in that period. 25,000. This is on top of the 60,200. So if you add that, you've got 85,000. If you look at the pensioner figures, you see that there was 90,000 in 1920 and it's down to 77. But as well as that, there are a great number of other deaths that are just not recorded in the sense of as to reason. So the total casualties, according to some, will be close on 100,000. So we go from 1 in 3, 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 of the AIF people who served overseas as casualties of the war. Now, the reason for this, there were two men, a chap called Coleman and a chap called Billy Hughes, both members of Parliament. And they got onto this. And fortunately, they used the facts and figures of the time. Now, Billy Hughes points out that the evidence that he had found from various sources, and he'd been Prime Minister, was that these men were dying like flies. What happened was, come home, get out of my uniform, forget all that, make up for lost time. Fit as a fiddle. And then 3, 5, 10 years later, I crash. And I'm susceptible to everything that's going on. And I die from it. Now, there it all is in the Hansard. It's fascinating stuff. But it's deadly, it's reminding you and me as to what happened. And then they get into the deficit bit. If you were AIF, your chances of dying after so many years was 75 in 1,000. If you were a chap who hadn't served in the AIF, it's 35, 25. Now, they also find that by 1933, if you've lived that long, there's a life deficit of 4 years. And they get the burnout digger expression starts to come in. Now, I find all this quite interesting in other ways as well, because I can see around me people saying, God, you're getting old, or isn't he or she old? There's a, once you're over, it used to be 60, but I think it's now 50. Once you're over that date, you're in the old category. And it starts to show. One of the most interesting articles I read recently was a lady that wrote in the Weekend magazine about 2 weeks ago. She's over 70, and she said to her doctor, why aren't you giving me these reminders about certain cancer tests, tests that I should do? Love, you're over 70. I remember saying to my doctor, what if one of these tests shows that I've got potentially prostate cancer? He said, well, we'll probably leave it alone completely, because if we touch it, we might kill you. Now, what's happening, and some of you are coming up against that, that's an attitude now, which I find amazing. But they start to talk about these AIF, first AIF men, as broken men, middle-aged, and they've lost the will to live. And we can understand that. Now, quickly, World War II. You might like to hear this. Some of you will drop onto it straight away. This is a press release in the Sydney Morning Herald, the 14th of August 1941. The Minister for the Army, Mr. Spender, said today that the incidence of war neurosis was expected to be less in this war than in 1914-18. This, he said, was because there was a general absence of any great degree of concentrated shelling on confined trench or garrison positions to which troops would be subjected for weeks. All right, you got that bit? Yep. Mr. Spender said that psychiatry was being used to treat sufferers from war neurosis, which affected 6,000 troops a year in the last war. 6,000 troops a year. One figure I found, and I'm not too keen about how substantial it is, that someone estimated 80,000 cases of shell shock in the First War. He added that psychiatrists objected to the term shell shock, which they say often retards the progress of patients. So when I looked up for Brooke, I found April to November 41. And here's the minister saying this concentrated shelling and air bombing of trenches was a feature of the First War. They'd already had Blitzkrieg right across Europe, the German Blitzkrieg program, which was intense bombing and shelling and the rest of it. They were about to get the whole jungle warfare bit, and so it goes. And yet, here's the Minister for the Army making announcements like that. Now, if you look at the RAF, and I'll just give some figures here, we've got a new term, LMF, lax moral fibre. Now, they had bomb happy as well for the troops, but for Air Force, it was lax moral fibre. And one of the books I read said that even Cheshire VC accused men of lax moral fibre. One figure that's used is that in 1944-45, 8,400 aircrew were diagnosed or dismissed or discharged from the Air Force with this condition or something related to it. But additional horror is that many of them were sent to work down the coal mines, for God's sake. What a shocker. Now, I'll just move quickly to the US participation. It is particularly important to remember the Americans came in late to the First World War and also what we call the Second World War. Now, they came in late in terms of 1917, and Salmon's recommendations, he's a US Army officer, were implemented in 1917-18 on this whole shell shock business. And they got a good grip on it. And they kept it there for Korea and the early days of Vietnam. Now, the most important aspect in terms of recruiting was that they introduced psychological testing. And you can see that, I think the figure is 800,000, 45% were discharged on reasons to do with mental or nervous disorders. Now, I've added here welcome home. My wife was 5, I think, when they were in 1945, she was at the post office in George Street, Sydney, and this shipload of men had come in from Asia and elsewhere, and there were bands and everything happening. So the band comes along, and here are these men who can march because they were in that physical state. Group after group after group, and the crowd's clapping and cheering and carrying on, until the truckloads of men who were being in POW camps came on the scene. And the noise stopped because no one knew how to treat these blokes. The public went quiet. Instead of saying somehow or other, congratulations, you survived, my wife can remember that reaction. Powerful stuff. Now, I did some work on prisoners of war. The last particular one is the 1980 high mortality rate in the first 14 years after they were discharged, and an alarming incident of depression in those that survived. One interesting press report was along the lines that the POWs in Europe were being released and rehabilitated to the UK, and the King and Queen gave these great garden parties to include these men. And when the ships with these men on them got back to Sydney or Melbourne or wherever, there were no crowds, just some officials to greet them home. Now, we move to PTSD. This book was donated to the library by David Hardacre, and Bob Taylor passed it to me. Nev Taylor passed it to me when he knew I was working on this subject. It's worth reading. This is an RAF psychiatrist, mainly talking about the period really from 1960 onwards and PTSD. Shell shock and all that stuff belonged to the British Army. The Americans had a different approach, and it was mainly called PTSD. Now, I didn't know whether to include the next bit. It's on the counter at the pharmacy where I get stuff for my medical condition at the moment. And it's a hammer driving in a nail. And it's talking about quitting smoking. You've got to do something about it. Well, when I see this, I'm reminded about 6 weeks ago, or a bit longer, when we're trying to work out why I've got a pain in the face with my GP. Comes and goes. And it came back and it's really hurting. So I go back to the GP. And he said, can you give me some signs of what's happening? And I said, I felt as if someone was driving a nail into my head. Now, my previous experience of pain was a couple of times I had kidney stones, and I thought I'd die. Until the GP said, Jim, your wife's been through that 3 times. And it all put it into perspective. Or when I got to a hospital casualty once for this condition, and they slipped some, when they found out what it was, and then they slipped some pethidine in, I thought, I can't believe this. Now, I put this in because I want you to think about what I've been talking about today in terms of pain. I've got a mate up the street who served Vietnam. Every now and again we have a great chat. I have another mate who's had 5 years of chemotherapy because of his service in Vietnam. And this question of pain that won't go away. Now, the American Psychiatrist Association got onto this. They went back to the time of the Civil War. They had various names for shell shock. They brought out a manual. They identified 22 different types of diseases. And then they introduced in 1952 a manual called DSM-1. It means Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's their Bible. And included in that, they had catastrophic stress reaction or gross stress reaction as a condition of resulting from warfare. And it was in there, and it was how the psychiatrist would assess an individual. Now along comes the Vietnam War. The salmon legacy is there. In Korea, when Korea broke out, they got onto the psychological thing fairly quickly and kept it under control. When Vietnam started initially for the Americans, they were well set up. They were forgetting some of the lessons, but the psychiatric side of it was fairly low. But what was happening was that men were coming back with all these horror stories. So what happened was that this expression, post-Vietnam syndrome or gross stress disorder, was removed from the manual in 1968. And the rationale for that was, if we stay in, we'll have to treat all these blokes with this condition. Great stuff. So we took it out. And Turnbull talks about the idea that, there's an article talking about this and saying what happened was that when you went to the Veterans Affairs and said, oh, I've got all these problems, they did not record your war history. They treated it as if it was just a civilian manifestation of the problems. So they'd lost this essential guidance. Now they put it back in later in 1980, but as PTSD. Now, we just get the link between the Brits and the Americans. The Brits are increasingly in trouble at home because of the IRA attacks in London in the 60s and 70s. The conventional wisdom, according to Turnbull, was stiff upper lip. If you crack up, it's because of some flaw in your character. Great stuff. I remember being in the UK in the late 60s, doing some training and work, and on the television, this terrorist group around Aden produced, I think it was the heads of 3 SAS officers they had captured and slaughtered. The first the world knew about it was when they announced it on television. Now, you can imagine the impact of that, not only on the SAS, of course, but on their families. Then along comes the Falklands War, what's called the Hungerford Massacre, and Lockerbie. And they all put a different slant on this question of PTSD. Now, if I come across Turnbull, I thank Turnbull for the introduction to this. I think it's magnificent. I just wonder where my reading, I hadn't picked it up before. There is nothing so stultifying to progressive human thought than a successful war. I think that's brilliant, right? Because we just revel in success. We don't look at what success should teach us. Now, when Turnbull looked at the Falklands War, it was the intensity and the shock of it that snapped the UK out of its lethargy almost. And when you look at the Exocet missile hitting the Sheffield and the intense land actions and stuff, the fact that it was also remote from the UK. And Turnbull makes the point that these men were on a big liner, casualties, and took a long time in a sense to get back. And then, according to him, it was all about Thatcher and political victory and the rest of it, and these blokes had suffered. Now what's happening is we're extending the casualty list. Now, the Hungerford massacre was a village near where this fellow Turnbull lived, RAF psychiatrist. A fellow who's got a shotgun licence has also got a stack of weapons, decides to go on a killing spree. The first person he kills is his mum with 2 kids. And he shoots her 13 times. And people are just shocked out of there. And goes on, kills a policeman and all sorts of people. Now the Lockerbie disaster teams, Lockerbie, the great Pan Am flight drops out of the sky all over the place, around Lockerbie. The people brought in to help, apart from the police and so on, are what they call mountain rescue teams. Now the job of these teams was to go out and find lost people in the scrub, in all sorts of places. And you get the example of, this is just prior to Christmas. So they're working for 3 or 4 days, and their job is to pick up the bits and pieces that fell out of the sky. And one fellow picks up, if I've got it right, he comes across the body of a lady who's now just jelly. She fell out of the sky, and when she hit, she just became jelly. Underneath her daughter is also jelly, and underneath the daughter, a little doll. Now, this fellow, this RAF soldier, had the task of removing those jellies. And there is this doll. A doll, exactly the same doll as he's bought for his daughter for his Christmas present. And from then on, the doll becomes a feature that he can't escape. Now, all these men needed his help, but the system, the army, the military system said it's Christmas. They come back after the break. They're desperately in trouble, come back in 2 weeks' time. But then you say, well, look at journalists are starting to say, what about us? Look at all these things we've covered. And then I heard a British-American journalist talking on ABC radio saying, why are you here? Why are you here? And he said, I want to see what they're doing about the journalists who are covering your Royal Commission, because they're going to be desperately affected by what they hear, let alone the Royal Commission stuff. Now we get Patrick McGorry in 2013 saying we've got 4 million people and it gets a real flood because of the election and it disappears. We get the Australian government at the time bringing out a new veterans mental health scheme for the next 10 years, 2013 onwards. Well, where have you been? Then you start to get individual cases of PTSD. Then you get this book, and I recommend you have a look at it, about exit wounds. And then you get what else is to come out of Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone whatever else is happening. But the big story I've not been able to touch yet is what happens to the families where these men survive. Ever since 1914. Here's your husband, he's insane, look after him. He's sick, look after him. I think that's more than enough.
Thank you very much, Jim, for an excellent presentation. got time for a few questions if anyone has.
Jim, thanks for that. It was great. In your research, were you able to find any comparison with the British and American side of things as against the Germans? Was their experience? Is there any data on that?
What helped their understanding and pushing on with doing something about studying at this special commission was that the German press had picked it up as well, and were talking about this whole problem that had affected their people. And it's a bit like saying, well, we've got a problem, and then you hear New Zealand's got the same problem. It helps. Well, yes, there was a lot of press attention to what happened on the German side. One thing I didn't mention about Tobruk was that the first effort to look after men who had nervous disorders was a lieutenant colonel, 2 lieutenant colonels at Tobruk in the garrison, Australians. And they had these cases coming in, and they were able to put 60% back in the front line and another 20% on base duties, and because of the immediacy of the response to what was happening. And that was a first. They didn't introduce psychological testing, I think, in the Australian Army until 43, Air Force and Army.
Early treatment is the most effective, which is well known.
And became a feature of field ambulances and casualty clearing stations, where they'd intercept these cases and hold them there as long as they could in terms of getting them back into action. That was the whole idea. But there was a more humane approach to it there. Yep.
Congratulations, Jim. I think that was terrific, and I know how much you must take out with you at times doing this. I was very interested in your comment about the fact that officers suffered very badly, and there was a link, obviously, between intelligence and I also understand, but I don't know if it's accurate, is that if you've had a more secure family environment when you were growing up, you probably suffer less. Have you found, was there any evidence of that?
Would you repeat the question?
Yes. The idea that would you suffer less in terms of, well, susceptibility to these conditions if you had a good family background and upbringing. I personally think that's probably the case, because what they were finding were there were all these pre-existing conditions caused for whatever reason. And it could be just in a word, as I said, luck now and you've got a problem. Or some incident happens and you've got a problem. So I think that psychological testing, I remember having an argument with a psychologist when I was commanding MUR. And we were trying to commission a number of officers, and the psychiatrist said, we don't think this fellow ought to get the job. He'll be commissioned. So I stood him up and said, my experience tells me that we should take a chance with this fellow. Now, in the event it happened. But that idea was still around in the mid-70s. I mean, I think the whole psychological testing is terrific. Incidentally, when they brought this four officers commission, there was nothing, the Navy had nothing to add to the idea of shell shock. And I'm thinking, how many ships were blown out of the water?
Jim, I understand that in the First World War in particular, maybe the Second World War, conscientious objectors who were recruited in the army as medical orderlies, they were recruited as medical orderlies, assuming that they were very much involved in picking up bodies and so forth, is there any sort of substructure in your studies to look at the effect conscientious objectors would suffer? I mean, to me they seem to be a double barrel issue of being conscientious objectors in the first place, and then pick up dead bodies in the second place. Is there any sort of subgroup you look at in that regard?
I didn't come across that, but what I did come across was one of the cases of PTSD that has happened in the last 6 months, or I came across in the last 6 months, was a US female medical surgeon, and her job was to treat burns victims. And she had to make fairly instant and very dramatic decisions about whether you take an arm or a leg off or whatever you do to someone to help him survive. And then subsequently see him if he recovers, without this, and you've caused it. And that became a major issue for her, and eventually collapsed for the whole PTSD. So it wouldn't surprise me that any number of people in that. And as I read from the article on shell shock, it affected people in different ways.
Any other questions?
The hesitancy of soldiers coming back to talk about the war, is that thing
Yes, I've only come across that in terms of, I was conducting tutorials on the Second War for Monash University at one stage, and one of their tasks was this question of an interview a serving member from the Second World War and present your findings as an oral history, 15-minute presentation. And people went off and found their character, and this young lady gets up and says, I finally got my dad to tell me what happened. And he said to me, darling, I'm telling you things I've never told your mother, but I'm coming up to dying and I want the story told. So she told her story. Now another presentation was concerning the bombing of Dresden. And this fellow talked about, this student said, I interviewed this fellow about, he wasn't in the bombing, but he had this very strong views about it all. And he said X, Y, and Z. And there was a bloke who, in my terms, was much older than me at that stage, sitting as a student. And he finally said, I was a bomber crew over Dresden. Right? Now, it comes in different ways. I remember when I was first commissioned, I was still teaching in Sydney, the fellow I sat next to had been Special Operations Australia. And I'd been commissioned as a commando officer, which was had been set up to do the same sort of thing. He did not say a word to me about Special Operations Australia until I was leaving the school. So that sort of suppressed memory, or hidden memory, for all sorts of reasons, big issue.
Okay, you can't hear. I'd like to reinforce that actually, because when I did the big oral history in the Naval and Military Club, so many of the wives, because I edited it with each person that was involved, and they would say to me the next time I went, I've never heard any of this before. And obviously the men had taken a very long time before they wanted to share their experiences. And my other experience is that most of them suffered to some degree, from my understanding of the symptoms. Some were very, very bad. And, you know, I had an ex-commando who, I mean, it's in the book if you want to read it, who admitted to me his wife came out afterwards to tell me how she'd woken up, he chased her around the house trying to throttle her. And he fortunately kicked his toe on something and woke him up, and he was horrified, and thereafter he sought medical help. And there are all sorts of bits and pieces when you arrive at the door and you're abused, and you know that if that person didn't have post-traumatic stress, he wouldn't be reacting that way, but he still wants to talk to you, so you sit down and do it. However, the other comment I want to say, that there is actually a psychiatrist in Melbourne, Paul Collier, and he did his medical research or his postgrad on a comparison apparently between World War II and Vietnam veterans, and his thesis. So I haven't read it, but I do understand it exists, so it might be worth, if anyone's interested, looking for the university library.
We've reached the time we normally finish 1 o'clock, but there are 1 or 2 more questions, I think. But if anyone feels that they must leave because they have to get back to work, please do so. And
Well, if they were just picking up something Jan said,
yes,
years ago as a young subaltern in the commando in Sydney, I was volunteered to do what they call the Code of Conduct course. And this was to put you in a situation where it was based on the idea of the experience that come out of the Korean War with regard to prisoners. And so I turned up in my smart outfit, told the next morning, make sure you're just in greens. you don't need your hat or anything. And I suddenly found myself locked in a prison at Middle Head. And it was on for a couple of days, straight, as if I was sitting around in the crib in the middle of some winter. And bang, it was on. And one of the problems was that it was so cold that in terms of trying to calm me, I was given a blanket. But the deal was, if the guard suddenly kicked the door open, or unlocked the door, and I wasn't standing to attention with my blanket folded, I was in big trouble, and all sorts of things could happen. I remember one occasion when I was drifting off, and I heard the door, whipped up the blanket, folded, and stood, thinking, I beat you, you bastard, something like that. Anyhow, this eventually stopped, and we were debriefed. We were all ragged, hadn't shaved the whole bit, and we said, well, stand down tonight, and we'll talk about all this for the next whatever. Now, I was living close enough to go home. So I got permission and I went home. And I said to Colleen what had happened. Anyhow, during the night, the same night, I leap out of bed, our double bed, rip the sheets off the tack, stand against the door and start to giggle. And Colleen thought I was ready for the hospital. Now, there may be more questions, but I remember, Colleen remembers that bit. And that was just a couple of days, let alone what the rest of that.
Big deal, Lily.
Just to turn it around a little bit the other way, Jim, one of the problems, I guess, is you get these young, fit men and women coming back out of Afghanistan and Iraq now, and full of confidence and full of bravado. So admitting to whether there's a problem or not is probably a problem.
Yep.
Terrible mixture of words. Is there any evidence that people are totally unaffected by war? You meet people who seem to be going along very well. My observation is the war hasn't affected them, or Vietnam hasn't affected them, or even our parents from World War II. Some seem unaffected and some affected. Is there any evidence that people come through with a complete clean bill of health, or is there some impact?
I haven't come across any study on that sort of thing, but this PTSD business and this manual the Americans have got, when you look at the 1980 version, they've got 4 pages of what they define as PTSD. 4 pages. So here's the condition, here are the symptoms, here are the reactions. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence of men being unaffected. I can't believe that they can be unaffected unless they've got some mental block. Seems unlikely.
I think that the answer is that everybody is affected, but some accommodate better than others.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I guess just a comment. I'm Robin from DSTO, but I was at the Comcare conference last week, and the big topic was psychological injury.
Oh.
That the APS recognise it, and that it's a huge cost factor for claims. Department of Veteran Affairs were there, and they talked about how soldiers returning and being able to access treatment for PTSD without putting in any compensation claims. Do you think the system is changing? And I know it's got a lot of obstacles because I see it with my work, but are they just talking? Is it just talk?
The work I've done on BCOF over now 20 odd years, maybe longer, I have a very negative situation about the way in which these people are treated. As I said, the BCOF people were serving under active service definition of service. So what happens in the 1986 Act, Veterans Entitlements Act, you change all the language. There's no mention of active service. You make it qualifying service. Oh, well, you haven't got any qualifying service. And just recently I was back at Miles Hill and talking to one of my colleagues whose dad was BCOF, and we talked about him many times. And she said he had leukemia, and he always traces it back to Hiroshima. And yet The week after he died, Veterans Affairs came in and said, you've got no claim. And I've come across that again and again and again. And it can be individuals that have just got this thing, or it can be the way they interpret them, or what they see as a law.
I was going to mention last night, talking to someone, the Military Medicine Federation had a meeting last year. They were not allowed to refer in any way to casualties in Afghanistan or Iraq. They were allowed to talk about the Second World War. People were told not to turn up in uniform from the Australian forces, and this was apparently should we say, a political decision at the highest level.
Well, my experience is full of it,
I can give you a name or two on that later.
of that sort of approach. It's just appalling. It's quite sickening. That's why I'm doing this case study. Getting chapter and verse to say, you've got to look after these people, they're dying like flies. The 20,000 who served in Beecroft are down to 2,000. But they're all well past it.
We've got time for one more question if there's something you feel is urgent.
I just, that was very interesting, Jim. Very good for us all to be reminded of this topic in the detailed way that you've presented it. My experience through the 37 years that I served with regards to tension and pressure was primarily to do with Northern Ireland, which I went through repeatedly, and all soldiers in Northern Ireland, including those in the headquarters, but all soldiers, men and women, felt the pressure of terrorism being so close to them. And in some cases, some bases, the likelihood of serious injury or being killed was remarkably high for the shortish periods that were there. So the whole topic is very relevant. I'm personally not surprised, and don't really have a big issue, with the historical gradual trend to understand it better. It happened, it's good for us all to look back on it, but I'm less critical of the past and how people reacted. Although it was bad, I'm less critical of that than I am interested in how it's handled now. And that's really more something for the serving officers. I would be curious to know how these lessons from the past have been translated into how military servicemen are dealt with in Iraq. Marcus would be a better place to answer that, or Ian Lilly. I have no concept.
Well, John Campbell, his book, Exit Wounds. I mean, when I first read the first few pages, I was reminded of that television coverage where I think it was, they managed to get a massive Iraqi convoy, take out the lead vehicles, take out the end vehicles, and then slaughter the rest because it couldn't go anywhere. And Campbell talks about that and other things. But the point I was making when I was talking about 1924 is the repetition of that, the belated manifestation of a problem, because we don't even have a name for it, or we don't accept that it's happening. And that happened with Vietnam people. You talk about Ireland and the rest. You know, the idea that the bloke put on a plane, gets on the next day back in Australia, and it's all is used to the idea of he's going to shoot at him. Who is the enemy? And he's back in Sydney, and it's still in his head.
But we do recognise it now, and so I think the issue is as much to do with leadership of today.
Yeah.
How do they mitigate those pressures when they're actually in an operational environment? I'm just flagging, I'm not asking for an answer. In my experience, when my company or my battalion or whatever came back from Northern Ireland, yes, there were some people who were deeply saddened, to use a very general phrase, by some of their experiences. But in the main, we all coped pretty well, and in the main, there was invariably a lot of pride in what we had accomplished. And my guess is that that's still the case, so it's a mix. And so there are two aspects to shell shock, if we can call it that. One is recognizing that there is a problem which has its roots in history, and the other is working out how best to help the servicemen and women who are serving today to cope. And that's a leadership thing as well as a compensation or compensatory matter.
Well, I'll just go back to the Trebrook incident. Someone took the initiative there and said, we've got a problem, and solved it on the spot by setting up this nervous condition clinic. And one of the successes for early Vietnam was that they were onto the problems because of the experience previously and started to treat them. But then the war just escalated and they can't have these conditions. Sorry.
It's a very interesting topic.
Just make a quick comment.
Yes.
The nature of operational services changed too. I mean, it's not a case of deploy, you're there for the duration and you come back after 4 or 5 or 6 years or whatever. You know, it's a case of now joining, you deploy for a period, you come back, you deploy again, you come back, you deploy, you come back. And indeed there's a new problem now, which is that serving members actually hide the fact that they're having challenges so that they're not discharged, basically. And you'll find, and I can predict this with some certainty, that the Special Forces community in particular is going to have a lot of issues come down the track because people have been hiding the fact that they've struggled with multiple deployments over the last 10 years.
And I've heard that.
And I just also make a comment, don't forget that John Cantwell continued to serve for 12 years and get promoted a number of times to be placed in command of a whole operation, despite the fact that he knew that he had some challenges. And so there's an example of somebody who's not declaring that there's an issue and continuing to move through a career.
Well, we've had a very interesting session, I think, this morning, and unfortunately I must bring it to a conclusion. Thank you very much for your attendance. Sir, thank you very much for
I'll just get out of here.
if you'd like to come have a seat. Just briefly before we go, our next meeting here is on Thursday the 31st of August. We'll be starting a bit earlier because, what did I say? I'm a bit out of date, aren't I? Street. Yes, the street. What if I make it Thursday the 31st of October? But we'll be starting a little earlier because it's our annual general meeting, which I'd like to start at 11:45 and keep it to a minimum, but allow time for our speaker after that. The speaker is going to be Brigadier Mike Annett, who is well known to many of you, and he's going to speak about Plan Beersheba, a 4-brigade perspective. So I hope to see you again next month at the meeting. Please remember it's starting a little bit earlier, but I'd like to see you here when we have the meeting, and also for the talk afterwards. Thank you very much, Jim, for your most interesting talk today, and look forward to seeing you again. Now you've got some stuff here. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Hey, Jim. John, is that Queen
Unfortunately, we cannot come to your next month because we will be in Thailand. But the most important thing is we miss the ATM.